blood he paid the rebels due, and in that final blaze of truth he raised the banner of the free to the vaulted sky. He ransomed his soul from the chains of shame, and from the pure clay of his being he shaped Iran. These lines come from a poem by Iranian poet Siyavush Khosrawi, written in the mid-20th century as a tribute to Babak Khorramdin, a 9th century rebel, heretic, and over time a symbol. More than 1,000 years separated the poet from his subject, yet Babak's defiance still burned bright enough to inspire verse. Over the centuries, Babak's story has been retold through many lenses: revolutionary, nationalist, mystical. His name carries layers of myth and memory. But Babak was no myth. He lived, he fought, and he led a real rebellion that shook the greatest empire of its time, the Abbasid Caliphate. And he did not stand alone. Behind him stood a movement, the Khurramites, radical, apocalyptic, and fiercely opposed to Abbasid rule. Neither fully Zoroastrian nor Islamic, they drew from deep wells of Persian religion, folk messianism, and anti-imperial rage. In this episode, we ask, who were the Khurramites, and why does this story still echo?
I'm Andy Al-Shuler, and this is Echoes of Heresy, a podcast about spiritual descent and divergent beliefs across time and tradition.
To understand the Khurramites, we must first examine the seismic shifts that occurred in Iran following the Arab conquests. The fall of the Sasanian Empire in the mid-7th century CE marked not just a political upheaval, but a profound transformation of Iranian society. The Islamic conquests introduced new religious paradigms, administrative structures, and social hierarchies. While Islam became the dominant faith, the process of Islamization was neither immediate nor uniform. Under the Umayyad and early Abbasid caliphates, non-Arab converts to Islam, known as Mawali, often faced systemic discrimination. Despite their conversion, they were frequently subjected to the jizya tax, a levy traditionally imposed on non-Muslims, and were excluded from certain social and political privileges reserved for Arab Muslims. This stratification fostered deep-seated resentments among the Iranian populace, who perceived their cultural and religious identities as being under siege. The status of Zoroastrianism, Iran's pre-Islamic religion, was particularly complex. Unlike Jews and Christians, who were recognized as Ahl al-Kitab, people of the book, and granted a degree of religious autonomy, Zoroastrians occupied an ambiguous position. While some Islamic jurists extended dhimmi status to Zoroastrians, this recognition was inconsistent and often contingent upon local political considerations. In general, Zoroastrians endured more severe social and legal disabilities related to identity marking, ritual impurity, and public humiliation as compared to Jews and Christians, reflecting their unique legal and social status under Islamic rule. For instance, they often could not maintain their fire temples, use bathhouses, use saddle while riding a donkey, engage in preparation of food for Muslims, and so on. Over time, these pressures contributed to the rapid decline of Zoroastrianism as a dominant religious force in Iran. For anyone curious about how this process unfolded, historian Michael Morony examines it in detail. The situation was even more precarious for adherents of Manichaeanism, a syncretic religion founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE. Manichaeans were often labeled as heretics and faced severe persecution. Scholar John C. Reeves highlights that under Islamic rule Manichaeans were frequently accused of zandaqa, a term used to denote heresy or even apostasy in some contexts. And those who were labeled zindiq in singular or zanadiqa plural were often subjected to harsh penalties, including execution. The concept of zandaqa became a powerful tool for Islamic authorities to suppress religious dissent and heterodoxy. It was employed to target a wide array of groups and individuals whose beliefs deviated from the dominant form of Islam in a certain place and time, effectively criminalizing theological diversity. So, Manichaean and theologically adjacent communities, once widespread in Iran, Caucasus, and Central Asia, essentially became crypto-worship groups posing as Muslims or Christians, depending on circumstance. Amidst this backdrop, the legacy of Mazdakism, a social religious movement advocating communal ownership and social equality, continued to resonate. Although suppressed during the Sasanian era, not too long before the Islamic conquests, Mazdakite ideals persisted in the collective memory and influenced subsequent movements that challenged established hierarchies. The spiritual map of Iran did not change overnight. Zoroastrianism, though politically dethroned, endured, especially in rural strongholds among remote fire temples and villagers loyal to hereditary priests. And from the ruins of official religion, something more elusive began to rise, a fusion of folk dualism, messianic yearning, and heterodox innovation. Into this volatile mix stepped a series of revolutionaries and would-be prophets, each claiming to speak for the oppressed, each drawing on the spiritual currents both new and old, running beneath Iranian soil. These prophets often used newly obtained but convenient Islamic terms while promoting doctrines influenced by all sorts of creeds at hand. Among the central figures of this spiritual political reawakening stood Abu Muslim of Khorasan, whose relation to the Orthodox Islam of his time and indigenous traditions of Persia was complex and nuanced and cannot be easily explained. Though publicly loyal to the Abbasid cause, Abu Muslim became a legendary figure in Iranian memory. After he was executed on charges of heresy by Caliph al-Mansur, his legacy took on mythical dimensions. Later rebels would claim him as undead, transfigured, or destined to return. Zoroastrian nobleman Sunbad, recent convert to Islam, was incensed by Abu Muslim's death and started the revolt, declaring that Abu Muslim had not died but would soon return to restore justice. His revolt, while short-lived, transformed grief into messianic rage, blending Zoroastrian symbology with Islamic eschatology. In this context, it also would be fair to mention Bi'afrid, a preacher active under the late Umayyads, who tried to revive Zoroastrian ethics while adopting certain Islamic practices. According to some sources, he also spent some time in China and likely was influenced by a form of Buddhist thought. Some accounts about Bi'afrid draw parallels with the story of Jesus, mentioning miracles and resurrection motifs. His message may have appealed to rural communities torn between fading Zoroastrianism and unfamiliar Islam, at the same time open to other spiritual currents flourishing across Persia and Central Asia. Executed by order of Abu Muslim himself, Biafrid in some way prefigured the tensions that would later explode in Khurramism. Ishaq al-Turq, another elusive figure in Khorasan, promised divine justice through revolt. We don't know much about his teachings, but what we know hints at a fusion of Mazdakite egalitarianism and proto-Shi'i apocalypticism. And most dramatically, there was Al-Muqanna, the so-called veiled prophet, proclaiming himself the divine incarnation of light. He wore a veil to shield mortals from his unbearable brilliance. His white-clad militarized followers spread across Central Asia, attempting to establish an apocalyptic theocracy. Though crushed, his vision endured, and his legacy, layered, esoteric, and poetic, will definitely deserve a full episode of its own in our show, when the time is right. This is, of course, not the exhaustive list of syncretic, messianic, and rebellious movements of the time. It is also worth to stress that these movements were not copy-pastes of each other, but they share deep thematic soil, a fusion of the cosmic and the political, the promise of reversal, the hope of restoration or evolution. They were part of a complex transformation of the Iranian religious landscape, a world where ancient cosmologies clashed with new empires, where fire altars dimmed, and secret gnosis flared up in mountain fortresses and desert encampments. In this crucible, Khurramism was forged, not as an anomaly, but as the most viable synthesis of resistance, heresy, and hope. Before we explore the beliefs and practices of the Khurramites, we must ask, how do we know what we know? The sources are fragmentary, often hostile, and always filtered through lenses of political and theological rivalry. But in their contradictions and omissions, they also reveal essential and generally corroborated details. Our knowledge of the Khurramites comes primarily from Arab Muslim chroniclers, later Persian historians, and some intriguing references in Christian sources. As you may imagine, most early Islamic accounts are polemical, framing the Khurramites as Zanadiqa, heretics, usually ones of a dualist type. But notably, there are sources presenting somewhat more nuanced picture. At-Tabari, one of the main chroniclers of the Abbasid period, in his History of the Prophets and Kings, Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, offers extensive but very hostile detail about their leader, Babak Khorramdin, and his revolt. He portrays Babak as a cunning rebel and his followers as subversive to Islam and state order. Other important sources are Al-Mas'udi and Ibn al-Nadim, who wrote around the same time as Tabari, and also combined their own observations with the earlier chronicles, which had not survived. They offer some broader ethnographic and philosophical perspectives. Though still critical, they are somewhat more descriptive than condemnatory, placing the Khurramites in the broader context of Iranian religious descent. Another 10th century chronicler, Al-Maqdisi, provides some of the most valuable surviving accounts of Khurramite beliefs and rituals. Unlike many other Islamic sources, his descriptions are relatively neutral, occasionally even sympathetic in tone. Al-Maqdisi appears less concerned with denouncing the Khurramites as heretics and more interested in objectively understanding and classifying their belief system within the religious landscape of the time. Later historian Ibn al-Athir, who wrote long after the events in the 13th century, draws on earlier sources and continues the negative portrayal, emphasizing military defeats and theological aberrations, but brings some important details that allow us to have more or less consistent picture of the movement. Byzantine authors provide scattered but significant references. The richest Byzantine narrative on the Khurramites in the context of their interactions with the Eastern Roman Empire, particularly during the 9th century, comes in the collection of chronicles known in the West under its Latin name, Theophanes Continuatus, and in its original Greek as Synechiste Theophanus, namely, continuation of the chronicle of the Roman state by Theophanes the Confessor, who wrote in the early 9th century. Joseph Genesius and John Skilitzis also give some important details. These references are mostly focused on Khurramites' presence and perceived strategic value within Byzantine military and diplomatic affairs. These sources are not much concerned with theological analysis, but they confirm Byzantine awareness of the religion Khurramites adhered to and the process of integration of Khurramite forces into the military structures of Romania. We also hear about Khurramites in Armenian and Syriac sources from the time. These accounts are brief and not exactly flattering. They mostly emphasize the violence of the Khurramite campaigns. But even through the disapproval, we catch the occasional glimpse of rituals, beliefs, and daily lives of the Khurramites. The overall picture that emerges from this patchwork of sources remains incomplete, but in broad strokes, it is quite coherent. Later Persian historiography, especially one written under Sunni patronage, generally reiterates early condemnations. Yet some texts, especially in local or Sufi contexts, evince a grudging respect for Babak's defiance. Court historians of Safavid and Qajar eras often framed Khurramites and other similar movements within a broader current of Persian and Shia resistance to Arab and Sunni domination, thus adapting them to the ideological frameworks of their own times. As a massive and influential movement, the Khurramites have long been noted in Western scholarship. Perhaps the first Western scholar who attempted to explore the movement in somewhat more or less detailed way was German Orientalist of the 19th century Gustav Flügel. Anyhow, for much of the 19th and early 20th century, they were still treated as little more than a colorful heresy or a footnote to Abbasid political history. The turning point came with Wilfred Madelung, whose entry on the Khurramis in Encyclopedia of Islam and later essays in the 1970s gave the movement a scholarly identity in its own right, linking it to Mazdakism and early Shi'ism. Madelung paid close attention to the religious affiliations, doctrines, and labels used in the sources, treating the Khurramis not as a vague heresy, but as a movement with definable links to early Iranian sects. In the 1970s and 80s, Clifford Bosworth added political and military context, situating Babak's revolt within the wider crisis of the Abbasid Caliphate. And then, Patricia Crone reshaped the field with her brilliant monograph, The Nativist Prophets of Early Islamic Iran, published in 2012. It was a groundbreaking exploration of Babak and related figures, situating them within a broader wave of Iranian counterworlds resisting the universal claims of Islam. For me, this book remains astonishing not just for its argument, but for its sheer range. It is almost encyclopedic, packed with references to Arabic, Persian, Syriac, Greek, Indian, and even Chinese sources, alongside a vast array of secondary scholarship. While its focus is on Iran's nativist prophets, it opens windows into the wider cultural and religious landscape of late antiquity and Middle Ages, making it one of the most illuminating guides to this world that I have ever encountered. Of course, the Khurramites in general and Babak specifically were studied extensively in Iran and Azerbaijan throughout the 20th century, and we cannot overlook the contributions of scholars such as Ghulam Hussein Yusufi, Ahmad Tafazzoli, and Ziya Bunyatov, who worked to interpret the sources in response to the growing demand for knowledge about the movement in their respective regions. Let's now focus on origins and ideology of the Khurramites. The name Khurramites derives from the Persian Khurramdinan, meaning those of the joyful religion. Likely the name they indeed called themselves as. The Arabized term Khurramiyya or Khurramdiniyya is first attested as early as 736 CE in Khorasan, a long way to the east from the epicenter of their later rebellion, and almost a century before the movement became widely known across Iran and beyond. This early appearance suggests that Khurramism existed as a recognizable religion or ideological current well before its later political and military expressions. At the heart of Khurramite belief was a dualistic cosmology, deeply reminiscent of Zoroastrian and older Iranian thought. They envisaged the universe as a battleground between light and darkness, with light representing the original, pure, and eternal state of existence, and darkness a later, corrupting force introduced into the cosmos. In this worldview, history itself moves toward the inevitable triumph and restoration of light. Despite the clear kinship between Khurramism and Zoroastrianism, it would be tempting but too simplistic to regard Khurramism as a derivative of Zoroastrianism. Patricia Crone, based on her detailed analysis of Khurrami beliefs, argues, quote, "If we strip Khurramism of its Islamic elements, what we are left with, clearly, is not Persian Zoroastrianism, nor is it simply Mazdakism as Muslim sources assume. What it is likely to be is local forms of the Western tradition as it had developed in interaction with the earlier religions of that region." End quote. Essentially, Crone understands Khurramism as a development of the ancient religion that prevailed among the Iranians before they were exposed to the Western tradition. In that case, Khurramism and Zoroastrianism would represent different developments of a heritage predating Zoroaster, rather than different understanding of a shared Zoroastrian tradition. Moreover, the formation of the Khurrami faith might be even more complex. Most likely the core tradition distantly related to Zoroastrianism, but still separate and parallel to it, developed largely independently. However, at times it was of course influenced by Zoroastrianism in its official and orthodox form, and by its heterodox offshoots like Mazdakism or Zurvanism, and perhaps by dualist Gnostic currents like Manichaeanism, and finally absorbed some Islamic elements. One of the key differences is that Khurramis appear not to refer to the supreme power by any name or clearly define its personality. Perhaps naming the supreme deity or calling it directly by name was discouraged within the community. Sunni heresiologists accuse the Khurramis of ta'til, avoidance of anthropomorphism, to the point of making God disappear as a person. The accusation later thrown at some Shia groups like Ismailis and certain Sufi schools. Some accounts suggest the use of more abstract or esoteric designations for the divine, or reflecting a henotheistic outlook, acknowledging multiple spiritual forces having complex relations with the matter, but subordinated to a single, ultimate source which remains abstract and utterly ineffable. Less hostile sources usually emphasize Khurramites clearly self-identifying as monotheists, despite these abstract notions of the divine. Orthodox Zoroastrians, in comparison, were very enthusiastic in applying anthropomorphic epithets to the supreme good, whose name, Ahura Mazda or Ormazd, in later pronunciation, is widely mentioned across scriptures, prayer directives, and official proclamations. Khurrami cosmology implies a hierarchical structure of divine beings or emanations, echoing both old Zoroastrian traditions and the influence of Gnostic and heterodox Islamic thought. Whether these were conceived as angels, spirits, or hypostases remains unclear, but they likely populated the spiritual order between humanity and the supreme light. The Khurramites leaned toward manifestationism rather than strict creationism, in a sense that the idea of manifestation of the divine within the material world was more pronounced than God's transcendence and regulation through a law. The material world was not seen as a deliberate good creation by a benevolent deity, but rather a corrupted or fallen realm, an intrusion of darkness into the original order of light. This cosmological framework underpinned their messianic expectations, with figures like Babak understood not merely as political leaders, but as manifestations of divine justice destined to restore cosmic balance. The Khurramites also embraced the concept of metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls. They believed that souls would reincarnate until achieving purification, a notion that set them apart from orthodox Islamic teachings and aligned them more closely with certain esoteric Shia sects, often categorized as a hulat. Modern scholars point at panpsychism of Khurramis, namely belief that the divine force permeates both animate and inanimate objects, and manifests fully through historically significant persons or the Khurrami community as a whole. Furthermore, they held that all prophets shared a single divine essence, appearing in different forms across time. This belief in divine incarnation extended to figures like Abu Muslim, whom they revered as a messianic figure destined to return and lead them to justice, perhaps through their current leaders, by means of reincarnation, descent, or passage of the Spirit. Khurramite rituals were characterized by simplicity and communal participation. They placed a strong emphasis on cleanliness, purification, and hospitality. Remarkably, wine played a significant role in their ceremonies, believed to have sacramental properties that facilitated spiritual experiences. Some historians report ceremonies of blessing over wine. Vegetarianism and avoidance of harm to the living beings is also noted as one of the key features of the sect. At the same time, there is clear indication that cows and bulls were slaughtered on special occasions, and the community took part in a ritual meal based on meat of the sacrificial cattle. And also, despite theoretical adherence to non-violence, Khurramites seem to be highly militarized in practice, even before their most recorded rebellion. Socially, the Khurramites advocated for egalitarian principles and communal ownership, reflecting the influence of Mazdakite ideals. They promoted the sharing of resources and controversially practiced forms of communal marriage or so-called wife sharing, which they reportedly viewed as a means to eliminate jealousy and promote social harmony. Accusations of wife sharing among the Khurramites mirror similar claims made by late Sasanian chroniclers against the Mazdakites centuries earlier. Whether these reports reflect actual practice or functioned as polemical distortions remains debated among scholars. As with many revolutionary or heterodox movements, allegations of sexual immorality, particularly the undermining of conventional marriage, served as powerful tools for delegitimizing dissent, framing such groups not only as political threats, but as dangers to the social and moral order. Patricia Crone interprets this practice as a form of reproductive strategy aimed at strengthening community bonds, thus ensuring its survival. Again, it is unclear to what extent this practice was common among the Khurramites, if it took place at all. The Khurramite syncretic identity was not merely theological, but also a form of resistance against the Abbasid Caliphate's religious and political dominance. By blending elements from various traditions, they created a distinct religious identity that challenged the prevailing orthodoxy and asserted Iranian cultural autonomy. In her Nativist Prophets, Crone notes that Khurramism served to insulate people, building religious walls around their communities when the mountains no longer sufficed. Crone highlights how their beliefs provided both spiritual solace and a framework for political rebellion. Babak Khorramdin is considered a central Khurramite figure, a face of the Khurramite brand, if you will. However, he was not the founder of the Khurramite movement. He wasn't even born into the Khurramite community in the first place. Babak's early life is hazy, but what we do know paints a picture of someone shaped by a crossroads of cultures and faiths. Some Syriac sources suggest his father came from an Aramaic Christian background with roots in southern Iraq. Though there are also mentions of his Persian ancestry in other sources. His mother likely came from a Zoroastrian-influenced community in Azerbaijan. Both parents were probably recent converts to Islam, common thing in that part of the world at the time. And there are various speculations about the nature of their relationship. We also find multiple legends on Babak's childhood where his mother encounters mystical signs of her son's future destiny. Babak himself was born with the name Al-Hassan, and his siblings had Muslim names too. He made a living doing manual work for wealthy Arab colonists in Azerbaijan, whom he left after some altercation incident. Then he became employed by local Iranian chiefs. That's likely how he found his way into the Khurramite circles. And there, young Hassan adopted traditional Persian name Babak, or in Arabized transcription, Babak, after an initiation or formal conversion into the Jewish religion. Despite his humble background and rather ordinary trade, Babak is described as a gifted speaker and someone with a taste for poetry and a talent for music, playing string instruments and singing. By the time Babak became part of the community in the early 9th century, Khurramism had already taken shape under earlier leaders, such as Javidan and Abu Imran. These two figures represented competing Khurramite factions in northwestern Iran, Their rivalry, possibly doctrinal but also territorial, ended violently when Javidan was mortally wounded in a skirmish. The same fight also led to Abu Imran's death. Babak, who was Javidan's disciple, succeeded him and secured his position by marrying Javidan's widow. This transition was not merely political. In the language of Khurramite theology, Babak became the mazhar, the earthly manifestation, mazhariya, of divine truth. As with earlier Iranian religious figures, the leader was not just inspired by the divine, but incarnated it in some way. The mazhar was a vessel or locus through which cosmic justice would be restored, blending Zoroastrian notions of the Saoshyants, the savior, perhaps also early Shiite imamology and sacred kingship of legendary Persian kings. Babak's authority was spiritual as much as strategic. Contemporary and near-contemporary Muslim chroniclers, though hostile, emphasize his personal magnetism and austere lifestyle. He became a symbol of revival of Persian dignity, justice, and vengeance against the perceived usurpation of Iranian destiny by Arab rulers. His mountainous stronghold in Azerbaijan and echo of sacred geography provided a refuge not just militarily, but cosmologically. The Khurramites framed their rebellion as a sacred war, jihad of truth against tyranny, enacting a kind of inverted caliphal rhetoric. Babak's rebellion, lasting from 816 till 837 CE, was deeply apocalyptic. Khurramite doctrine portrayed history as cyclical, with eras of corruption followed by the emergence of a redemptive figure, and Babak filled this role. Islamic chroniclers, particularly At-Tabari and Dinavari, report that Babak revived or repurposed fire temples in Khurramite territories. These were no longer orthodox Zoroastrian institutions, but ritual spaces adapted for Khurramite ritual needs, where fire symbolized not only purity and divine presence, but also resistance and apocalyptic renewal of the world. Babak's followers were said to have worn red garments, perhaps signifying blood, transformation, or esoteric allegiance. It is not clearly determined in the sources was the red garment a distinct feature of the movement before Babak, or was it introduced by him when he took over and unified warring factions of the Khurramites. Rituals at the time included communal meals, simple but emotional liturgies, and sermons. While direct Khurramite texts did not survive, historians mention their use of poetry, music, oral slogans, and possibly encoded symbols that point to existing initiation practices, doctrinal coherence, and elaborate ritualism. We'll pause here for now. The story of the Khurramites is too vast, too full of turns and echoes to fit into a single telling. So this time, unlike in earlier episodes, we'll let the tale unfold in two parts. In the next part, we'll follow the rebellion as it rises to its height and trace how Babak's defiance ended in both tragedy and legend. We'll also see how echoes of this movement refused to fade, leaving marks on history long after their defeat. Stay tuned for part 2. I'm Andy Altshuler, and this is Echoes of Heresy. Thank you for listening.